My name is Hannah Sullivan, and on February 16th, 2019, my life changed forever. I never imagined that a normal Sunday, one like any other, would lead to my death, a face-to-face encounter with Jesus, and a revelation that would shake everything I believed about worship. For years, I had been the worship leader at my church, completely devoted to what I thought was my calling, to create powerful worship experiences, to lead people into the presence of God, and to use music to bring glory to Him. But after I died for 4 minutes, Jesus showed me something that shattered my understanding of what worship had become. I thought I was leading people to Him, but the truth was, I had been distracted, and so was much of the church. The music, the lighting, the stage presence, the production, all of it had started to take precedence over true, intimate worship. And what He revealed to me wasn't just about my own church. It was about churches all over the world, about how the enemy had subtly infiltrated worship, twisting what was meant to glorify God into something centered on performance, self, and entertainment. It is not that worship had been removed from the church. It had been distorted. That Sunday morning had started just like every other. I woke up early, my mind already running through the details of the service. Set lists, transitions, sound checks, camera angles for the live stream. It was all second nature to me. Worship had to be flawless, I told myself. Excellence was our standard. If we wanted people to engage, to really connect, everything had to be just right. The music, the lighting, even the way we moved on stage. By the time I arrived at church, the worship team was already warming up. I greeted the musicians, making sure everyone had what they needed. As we rehearsed, my mind was half in the music, half in the logistics. I barely thought about God, about the actual meaning of the words we were singing. I was focused on the execution, not the intention. The service itself went smoothly. The congregation sang loudly, hands lifted, voices full of emotion. By all appearances, it was a powerful time of worship. But even as I stood on stage, something inside me felt off. There was an emptiness, a lack of true connection that I couldn't quite explain. After the service, I packed up my things, still nitpicking everything that could have been better. The drummer was slightly off-tempo during the second song. The transitions between sets could have been smoother. The live stream audio didn't sound as good as it should have. I was so caught up in critique and perfectionism that I barely noticed how exhausted I felt. Driving home, my mind was still running through every little mistake, still planning how I could improve things for next week. I reached for my phone to check a message from our production team, and that's when it happened. A blaring horn, the flash of headlights, a sickening crash of metal against metal. The world spun violently, my body slamming forward, and then nothing. When I became aware again, I wasn't in my car. I wasn't in pain. I wasn't even inside my body anymore. Instead, I was floating above the wreckage, looking down at the horrifying scene below me. The mangled remains of my car sat motionless at the intersection. Glass shattered across the pavement. I saw paramedics rushing toward my body, their movements frantic, their voices urgent. I should have felt panic, but instead I felt a strange detachment, like I was simply observing something distant. I knew it was me down there, but at the same time, I didn't feel connected to that body anymore. Then, suddenly, everything around me changed. The accident scene faded, and in its place, I saw something beyond human comprehension. A light appeared, but it wasn't just light. It was alive, powerful, full of love and holiness. It wasn't just something I was seeing, it was something I was being pulled toward, drawn into. As I moved closer, I felt every ounce of fear, worry, and earthly attachment dissolve, replaced by an overwhelming peace and awe. And then, standing before me was Jesus. There are no words to fully describe what it was like to be in his presence. I had spent my life singing about him, leading others to worship him, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for this. He was not just a historical figure, not just an idea or a belief. He was more real than anything I had ever known. The moment I looked into his eyes, I felt completely known, completely exposed, and yet completely loved. It was like he was looking through me into the deepest parts of my soul, seeing everything. Every doubt, every hidden motive, every thought I had ever had. I fell to my knees. I couldn't stand under the weight of his holiness, his truth, his love. And then he spoke. "Hannah," he said, his voice filled with both love and sorrow, "what have you been worshiping?" Before I could answer, everything around us shifted. Suddenly, I was no longer standing in his presence. Instead, I was in what looked like a great observation room, a place where I could see into churches all over the world. At first, everything looked beautiful. I saw huge worship services, mega churches filled with thousands of people, stunning lights, moving music, passionate leaders leading heartfelt songs. It looked powerful, emotional, full of energy. But then, Jesus showed me what I had never seen before. In the spiritual realm, demonic forces moved among these services, feeding off the vanity, the pride, the performance-driven mindsets. They weren't stopping worship, they were corrupting it. I saw worship leaders singing not to glorify God, but to gain recognition. I saw churches using music to draw crowds, to build a brand, to grow their influence, not to bring people into the true presence of God. And worst of all, I saw myself. I saw my own church's last worship service. I saw myself standing on stage, thinking more about the sound mix, the lighting, and the execution than about God himself. My lips had been singing to him, but my heart had been far from him. Tears filled my eyes. "Lord," I whispered, "I thought I was worshiping you." Jesus looked at me with deep sadness. "Your voice was singing to me, but your heart was focused on everything else." A crushing realization hit me. I had spent years chasing perfection in worship, thinking I was doing it for God, but I had missed the point entirely. Tears blurred my vision as I stood frozen in the spiritual observation room, watching the truth of modern worship unfold before me. I had believed for so long that my ministry was pure, that my heart was fully devoted to Jesus, but now I could see what he saw. The enemy wasn't trying to stop worship. He was infiltrating it, distorting it, using it to feed self-glorification rather than true surrender to God. As I continued to watch, I saw demons moving through churches, their presence unseen by the people, yet feeding off the vanity and misplaced focus. In some places, the stage had become a throne for worship leaders, rather than an altar before God. Instead of leading people into deep, reverent adoration of the Lord, they had become performers, striving for applause, recognition, and influence. Some worship songs had been subtly rewritten to make them more about people's emotions and less about God's holiness. The lyrics were designed to inspire feelings, but they lacked the power of true surrender and truth. Instead of leading people to humility before the throne of God, they were leading them into self-focused spirituality, worship that revolved around their personal breakthroughs, their emotions, their dreams. It had become a spiritual transaction rather than a sacrifice of praise. I felt a crushing weight in my chest. Had I done this? Had I unknowingly participated in a system that was corrupting worship rather than restoring it? Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with both love and grief. The enemy does not need to stop worship, he said. He only needs to change its direction. I felt those words pierce through me like a blade. Lord, I whispered, my voice shaking, I never wanted this. I wanted to lead people to you. I wanted my worship to be pure. He nodded, and for a moment, there was silence. Then the world around me shifted again. I suddenly found myself standing in a different place. Unlike the massive churches I had just seen, this was a small room, dimly lit, with only a handful of people gathered together. There was no sound system, no grand stage, no flashy production, just people lifting their voices in raw, humble worship. But in the spiritual realm, this room was radiating with glory. The prayers and songs of these people were ascending like fire, piercing through the darkness, reaching directly to heaven. The presence of God was so thick, so tangible, that even I, standing outside of time, felt myself tremble under the weight of it. There were angels among them, worshiping alongside them, joining in their adoration of the Lord. No one was concerned about their voices, their appearance, or who was watching them. They were simply there to worship Jesus, to glorify him with all that they had. Jesus spoke again, his voice filled with longing. This is what I desire. Worship that is not about the sound, the performance, or the production, but about me. Worship that is not led by talent, but by hearts that are fully surrendered to my presence. I watched as one of the women in the small gathering began to sing, her voice raw and unpolished, but full of genuine devotion. And in that moment I understood. This was what heaven responded to, not perfect performances, not stunning stage productions, but a heart that was fully yielded to God. Tears streamed down my face as I looked at Jesus. Lord, how did we get it so wrong? His face held a deep sorrow. Because you have been taught that worship is an experience rather than an offering. Jesus then took me back, far back, to a place before time itself. I saw something that sent a shiver through my soul. Lucifer, before he fell, he had been heaven's worship leader, created with instruments within him, designed to reflect the glory of God in worship. But his downfall had come from pride, the desire to be exalted, to have worship centered on him rather than on the Lord. I saw how his rebellion led to his expulsion from heaven, but his knowledge of music, of the power of worship, of the spiritual effect of sound and praise remained. He had not forgotten. He had not abandoned his understanding of how worship moves the spiritual realm. And now he was using that knowledge against the church. Instead of stopping worship, he was redirecting it. He was making it about fame, about record sales, about personal glory, about stage presence, about branding rather than surrender. He was using worship as a distraction rather than a weapon of spiritual warfare. A deep grief filled my soul. I had never seen worship as a battleground before, but now I knew this was one of the greatest battles of our time. I turned to Jesus, my heart breaking. "Lord, what do you want me to do?" He looked at me with eyes so full of love and urgency that I felt my spirit shake. "Restore true worship," he said. "Tell them what you have seen. Call my people back to the heart of worship." I nodded, weeping. "But what if they don't listen? What if they think I'm wrong?" He reached out, placing his hand over my heart. "Some will reject it, but those who are truly seeking me will hear my voice through you. It is not your job to convince them. It is only your job to speak the truth." At that moment, everything around me exploded in light, and I felt myself being pulled backward, back into my body. I gasped for air as my eyes flew open. I was back. The hospital room was silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor beside me. My mother was sitting in the corner, eyes red from crying. As soon as she saw me wake up, she burst into tears, rushing to my bedside. "Hannah, oh my God, you're awake." Doctors and nurses flooded the room, their faces filled with shock. I had been clinically dead for over 4 minutes, and yet here I was, alive, breathing, completely unharmed. But I was not the same person who had died. Over the next few weeks, I struggled to put into words what I had seen, what I had learned, what Jesus had shown me. The first Sunday I went back to church, I stood on stage as usual. But as the first song began, I couldn't sing. I couldn't go back to worship as usual, pretending that I hadn't seen the truth. Instead, I stepped forward, gripping the microphone with trembling hands, and told my church everything. At first, there was silence. Some people looked shocked, others moved to tears, and some uncomfortable with the truth. But then, something incredible happened. People began falling to their knees, weeping, repenting. The Holy Spirit moved in a way I had never seen before. The presence of God filled the room, not through production, not through perfect execution, but through humble, surrendered hearts. Worship was restored. If you have ever felt like something was missing in worship, if you have ever questioned why it sometimes feels more like a performance than an offering, Jesus is calling his church back to the heart of worship. Worship is not about us. It is not about lights, production, or perfection. It is about Jesus. If this message has touched you, share it. Someone needs to hear this truth, because in the end, worship is not about sound. It is about surrender.